This is a great one, too. You know, one of the things that we've talked a lot about is that the same principles which transform an individual's life transform a country and transform a world. That is why I have felt so strongly that people who are involved in the transformational personal growth, recovery fields, worlds, et cetera, are the last people who should be sitting out the political process. Because if you know what changes one life, you know what changes the world. And one of the issues that anybody interested in personal change is aware of is forgiveness. Without forgiveness, change does not happen. Without forgiveness, you cannot let go of the past. Without forgiveness, you can't get unstuck. Without forgiveness, you cannot create anew. And the world has a feeling today, not in terms of individuals so much, but in terms of world conditions. You see this in the United States with race issues. You see this around the world, all over the globe, where enmity seems so intractable sometimes that you kind of just can't even imagine how people are going to break free of that. And they have political meetings and all kinds of things, but they're not getting to the heart of the matter. And in a way that only forgiveness can do. Now, there are people, once again, it's not like everybody in Washington is an idiot and doesn't know any of this. Actually, there are people who are very aware of these issues and are applying them in terms of political change. We need to know who they are, we need to support them, and we need to join with them. And our next speaker is such a woman. Her name is Eileen Borris. She's recognized internationally as an expert on forgiveness, on relationship building, on trauma recovery, on peace building and reconciliation. She has developed and implemented peace-building programs in more than 15 of the most unstable and war-torn countries. She's trained high-profile individuals and groups, including diplomats, peacekeepers, and humanitarian organizations. She leads the charge to end cycles of abuse and revenge from centuries past. She is president of Forgiveness International. She has served as director of training and program development in the Institute of Multi-Track Diplomacy. She has addressed the United Nations General Assembly. She has lectured at the most prestigious universities in the world, including the #1 ranked School of International Business Education, the Thunderbird School of Global Management at Arizona State University, where she works today. This is a woman who understands about the individual transformation of the heart and how to apply it for changing the world in which we live. How lucky are we she is here with us today. I'm honored to introduce you to Dr. Eileen Borris.
Thank you so much, Marianne, for inviting me here today and to be able to speak to all of you, this wonderful, wonderful audience who's just so excited to make a difference in the world. We need all of you. There's a place for all of you, and I just am so honored to be able to be here and to talk to you. And so what I'd like to share with you today is to talk about a very simple aspiration, but which is so difficult to achieve. And it's a theme that you've heard about all morning: peace. What do we mean by peace? We all think that peace is a good thing. We all want it. We all talk about it. But do we really understand what peace means? You cannot build a nation or rebuild a nation if you don't understand what peace stands for. And you can't have peace in the world if you don't have peace within yourself and in your community. There can be no possibility of peace in war zones, in countries in conflict, in communities, in places where there's racial injustice, where there is corruption. All of this is just so commonplace without two key elements. You need forgiveness and you need intention. Peter Senge, an organizational learning and systems thinking expert and author of the book, fifth discipline. And Daniel Goleman, author of Emotional Intelligence, discuss in their book, The Triple Focus, the importance of developing a triple focus skill set. And this includes understanding the inner, the other, and the outer. Daniel Goleman discusses what is meant by inner focus, focusing in on ourselves, focusing in our interior world. This also involves connecting with our sense of purpose, why we're here, and our deepest aspirations, and understanding why we feel the way we do and what to do about those feelings. Goleman also discusses another important focus, the other. Being able to understand the other person's perspective, being able to understand their reality instead of always being so focused in on ourselves. And when we're able to really connect with another person, we're developing empathy and compassion, and we're able to deepen a relationship on a very human level. Peter Senge explains the third kind of focus, the outer, understanding the outer world, the way systems interact and create webs of interdependence, whether these interactions are in the family, in an organization, in the community, or the world at large. In this skill set, we have the ability to analyze the dynamics of, if I do this, the consequence is that. And we have the ability to use these insights to change the systems for the better. These are the skills that we need to develop to have forgiveness from the personal level to the political level. Forgiveness requires a conscious choice to see a situation differently, not through the eyes of anger, fear, or guilt, but to see the circumstances with compassion and understanding. Forgiveness is one of the hardest things we could ask anyone to do, but it's also one of the most powerful actions we can take. If we think of the difficulties of how to forgive, we may never achieve it. But what we need to recognize is that there are steps that we can take along the forgiveness process, and anyone can do it. We all have the capacity and the ability to forgive, but we must have the pure intention to do so. Having the intention of peace whenever we interact with anyone when seeking to achieve forgiveness is vital. It is of vital importance. Intention is king. Intention is more than language. All concrete actions first start with intention. Then it moves to thought, then to words, and then it is framed in concrete action. You can say, I want peace, but if your intentions aren't in alignment with what you say, your words are meaningless. Your intention is what you will manifest. And we've kind of heard this theme starting this morning, even with Dennis's talk about how important it is what we want and what we will to want. And this is the same with intention. Your intention is what is going to shine through. And this is what's so difficult to change. You cannot, in any situation, legislate people's true intention. The death of Michael Brown in Ferguson by a white police officer and the subsequent failure to charge this police officer raised racial tensions in the United States to such a degree that protests were taking place throughout many cities in our nation. What had happened since then only served to raise these racial tensions. In early March, the Department of Justice said it had found systematic discrimination against African Americans by the Ferguson, Missouri Police Department. The findings released by the Justice Department of the Civil Rights Division really showed the discriminatory practices that were practiced by those in power in Ferguson, those same people whose job was to protect the community. The entire criminal justice system was brought into question because of the findings of the Justice Department. And I'd like to share with you some of the statistics. 85% of all vehicles stopped between 2012 and 2014 were African American. 93% of the people who were arrested were African American in the same time period. 90% of all citations and 95% of the jaywalking tickets that were given out were to African Americans. This is an indisputable pattern showing the discrimination by the criminal justice system of African Americans in a city where only 67% of the population were African Americans. The investigators stated, "Our investigation has revealed that these disparities occur at least in part because of the unlawful bias against and the stereotyping of African Americans." During the civil rights movement in the 1960s, the argument posed was that civil rights legislation was going to be ineffective because you cannot legislate what's in people's hearts. And this is evident today. Those in positions in power in Ferguson and in other cities across this country that suffer from racial inequality can put any spin they like on it. They can say that we need to end discrimination and racial bias, and they want to have change, but they need to have the intention to do so. Without this, these are just empty words. And what we have found 50 years after Bloody Sunday is that by legislating the outward behavior, such as integrating schools or putting into place equal opportunity employment, and changing the external behaviors, over time, we can have an impact on people's intentions to a certain extent. But this is not enough. We here in the United States of America desperately need to meaningfully reconcile with our racial history. And we need to move on. But before we can do that, we need to atone and make amends for the injustices of the past. Slavery existed. The Ku Klux Klan existed. Hatred existed and still does today. We cannot sweep this under the rug, and we cannot play dumb about this. These are real things we need to deal with. The civil rights movement in the 1960s sought equality. Today, over 50 years later, we are still waiting for true equality to be seen. We as a nation need to apologize and strive to make real amends. We cannot just speak about equality, we have to enact it. Situations like we see in Ferguson and elsewhere in this country can't keep on happening, but unless we initiate real change, we run that very risk. Political forgiveness has a role in securing peace and equality in our country. It arises as a social necessity when confronted with long-standing inequality and violence, and it involves the willingness to change our intentions from those that are based in the need to perpetuate violence and inequality to a commitment to break these cycles. The past can never be changed. We can only ensure that the future will be different and that the past injustices are not repeated. Forgiveness accepts that the past is unchangeable, but asserts that our reactions to it are not. This is a highly transformative way of thinking about forgiveness, and our true intentions will determine the actions and what will happen. Forgiveness on a political level is a form of action tailored to the singularity of our communities and issues or conflicts it has endured, and it helps us to open up new paths to end injustice and abuse and to come to terms with its consequences. In this sense, political forgiveness does not address the psychological overcoming of feelings about a person. Rather, it refers to a broad social context that is constituted by a plurality of subjects in a political scenario. And this means that it's not concerned about a psychological transformation of one person. Political forgiveness focuses on the transformation of the social field that sustains them. Individuals in the United States are just that, individuals. We focus on ourselves, we value our independence and our individual families. We have a nation without nationalism and neighborhoods without communities. Herein lies the root of our problem. We don't work together. We nurture our grudges and not our neighbors. There is a program called Schools of Forgiveness, which teaches us to be able to let go of our anger and learn how to forgive, which then enables us to let go of our grudges. This is how we begin to build or rebuild our community. The Schools of Forgiveness, which, by the way, began in Bogota, Colombia in 2003 and has spread throughout all of South America, into Mexico, into Cuba, and now we're taking it to English-speaking countries in Africa, the Middle East, and in Eastern Europe. These schools help victims and offenders heal through the process of transforming their painful emotions and their negative narratives and generating new social capital that facilitates peace building in the midst of conflict. By removing the emotional, the behavioral, and the cognitive barriers to reconciliation for both the victims and the perpetrators, the Schools of Forgiveness and Reconciliation helps the community to rebuild key pillars of human existence. It gives us back our meaning in life. It gives us our psychological and our physical security, and it helps us with our social integration. Even if forgiveness and reconciliation are intangible actions, we do have tangible results. We have seen the schools of forgiveness spread throughout cities and countries around the world. There have been newspaper reports, and there have been TV shows and radio programs which have shared the stories of very enthusiastic participants as they share how these schools have impacted their lives. We have seen this program be very successful in schools where parents and teachers have been able to demonstrate how the academic performance and the behavior of children have greatly improved. And we have seen that couples in conflict and people who are going through divorces, as well as victims of any kind of violence, have all enthusiastically expressed their appreciation and gratitude. And in Colombia, where these schools have started, a network of youth for reconciliation is rapidly growing. And this is just an example of a program that we're bringing to the United States and adapting it to the needs of communities like Ferguson that have been decimated by injustice, bias, and violence. I was really touched as we began this program today when Marianne first spoke and then Dennis spoke about really looking at our forefathers. And what did they stand for? What did they represent? And so I'd like to just begin to talk a little bit about one of our great presidents, Abraham Lincoln, who powerfully demonstrated the idea of restorative justice in his approach to national healing and the reconstruction of the United States in the aftermath of the Civil War. For Lincoln, the great challenge in confronting the evils of slavery and the resulting destruction from a costly and bloody civil war was to pursue a forward-looking strategy that would heal the nation's wounds. The goal was not to pursue retribution, but to promote political reconciliation and national unity. Lincoln's forward-looking strategy emerged with his famous Gettysburg Address in November of 1863 and his subsequent proclamation of amnesty and reconstruction. At the battlefield at Gettysburg, Lincoln, after paying tribute to those who had given their lives so the nation may live, rededicated the country to an ongoing task of advancing a free and equal society based on the government of the people, by the people, and for the people. He sought to honor the dead, but he did so by calling on the citizens to dedicate themselves to the forward-looking task of building a free society, so that these dead shall not have died in vain. Perhaps the most compelling expression of the Lincolnian restorative justice strategy is in the President's second inaugural address, a speech that he gave on March 4th, 1865, only 37 days before the Civil War ended and shortly before his own death. In the inaugural, Lincoln acknowledged that both parties to the war had asked for God's aid, but he suggests that the path forward is through non-judgmentalism, and he called on his listeners to judge not, lest we be not judged. The way toward national healing is not to be found in righteous indignation, recrimination, or retribution, but in the quest for political unity through an all-embracing communitarianism rooted in charity. This call for national reconciliation and moral restoration is movingly expressed in the end of Lincoln's second inaugural address. And he shared these words: "With malice towards none, with charity for all, with the firmness in the right as God gives us to see this right. Let us strive to finish the work we are in, to bind the nation's wounds and cherish a just peace among ourselves and among other nations. Lincoln's post-war strategy focused on the question concerning political reconciliation and communal restoration by emphasizing the reconstruction of a shared political identity. What he said then still holds true now. We need to be united. We need to reconcile. And we need to practice forgiveness. We need policies that focus on the triple focus skill set that involves the inner, the other, and the outer. This is vital to the success of all our policies. There needs to be a high-level commitment to racial and economic justice in this country, and we need to change the systems to address the current inequality that exists within them. Many people have lost confidence in the political establishment in this country, and we've been hearing a lot about that this morning. The constant sound bites that you can hear across the aisles bickering and the inability of Washington to get things done have led to a lack of action. If we continue along this path, things will never get changed. And as we've heard today from Marianne and all our speakers, this two-party political process is broken, and we need real change, and we need it now. What we've outlined here are real opportunities for change and real policies that can make a difference. But the question now becomes, is the leadership ready to accept and indeed initiate them? Obama's speech in Selma on the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights March was a powerful one, and I feel may sum up where we are today. And so I would like to close with his words. 50 years after Bloody Sunday, our march is not yet finished, but we are getting closer. 239 years after this nation's founding, our union is not yet perfect, but we're getting closer. Our job's easier because someone has already gotten us through that first mile. Someone has already gotten us across that bridge. When it feels that the road is too hard, and when the torch that we have passed has become too heavy, we will remember these early travelers and draw strength from their example. We honor those who have walked so we can run, and we must run so our children can soar, and we will not grow weary. For we believe in the power of the awesome God, and we believe in this country's sacred promise. We can do what is necessary. We have the inner strength, and we have the spiritual wisdom to move forward and to heal our nation. Let the principles of forgiveness guide us as we embark on this journey together. Thank you.
Dr. Eileen Borris. Eileen, I am so sorry. I'm so happy that you brought up the topic of racial reconciliation and forgiveness between races in the United States. After our lunch break, Lynn Lyman will be here and Lisa Bloom. And we will be speaking about not only the mass incarceration issue, which is very much a demonstration of racial inequality in the United States in some truly horrifying ways. But also we will be talking about the drug war and its relationship to so much of this. I wrote an article, you can look it up on the internet, called Race and Repentance in America. And also in my book, Illuminata, I have the ritualized apology to African Americans. You know, it is much easier for people to forgive when the other person has had the graciousness to apologize. And one of the things that you mentioned was that we ourselves have to atone. I think with Black Americans, there's a lot of, well, you just need to forgive us. Hello. You just need to get over that. This very patronizing, condescending attitude that makes people not want to forgive. I know in my own life, just on a personal level, I'm very forgiving as long as somebody will just acknowledge they did it and apologize. And that's when it's so hard when they don't. The United States, as you said, Lincoln not only said, with malice towards none, with charity for all, and of course, his having died when he died, set the nation on the course towards Ku Klux Klan, John Birch Society, white supremacy, and so forth, in a way that it is reasonable to assume would not have occurred had Lincoln lived, for the very reason that you said. He also established a National Day of Atonement and Prayer. And he said in his proclamation of the National Day of Atonement and Prayer that nations must confess their sins, just as people must, and that individuals must, and that nations must atone for their sins. And this issue of race in America, and this, you know, we've taken this very corporate attitude, do not complain, do not explain. And the fact that the United States will not once and for all deeply apologize for slavery. You can kind of understand right after the Civil War how the North felt. We've given hundreds of thousands of our sons for this. What more do you want from us? But as generations have moved forward, the idea that this wound is past is so clearly incorrect. Germany after World War II, the mea culpa was complete. Nobody pretended, well, it wasn't all that bad or anything. I mean, there were certainly the Holocaust deniers, but they certainly were not represented by any kind of government perspective or action. Reparations. You know, reparations are a very common conversation. The Germany reparations to Jews or Jewish organizations, billions of dollars, as well they should be. By the 20th century, that's kind of understood. But when it comes to African Americans, the idea of reparations in the form of educational opportunity and economic opportunity, people act like it's an absurd idea. It's not an absurd idea, because restitution is an important part of justice. So this idea of the United States, I know several years ago, an Ohio congressman suggested a congressional apology for slavery. And I remember Newt Gingrich was the secretary, he was the House Speaker at the time. He would not let the bill go anywhere. And he said, tell me how that will teach one child to read. But I'll tell you how it would teach one child to read. 2 popes ago, Pope John Paul went around apologizing. Right before he died, he apologized for a lot of things on behalf of the Catholic Church. Do you know much about that? Yeah, and including the Inquisition and so forth. And he had a phrase called the purification of memory. And he said, if you do not apologize for what you've done in the past, then you remain unconscious of the ways that you repeat the error in the present and the future. And I think too many Americans do not realize how many of the economic and social and educational policies of the United States are in fact legacies of slavery and have underpinnings of racism that most people are not even conscious of. So I so appreciate that you're bringing into this conversation the idea that a wound, and we know this, until you have apologized, there might be somebody that you are still having some bitterness in a relationship from 25 years ago. And what it does and how it frees your soul when you apologize, or how it frees your soul when you forgive. But when it comes to race in America, it always is like a burden put on them that they're supposed to just forgive us, as opposed to the burden being on us that perhaps we need to apologize. And it's not, people say, well, I wasn't a slave owner, my grandparents weren't slave owners. There's a difference between taking blame and taking responsibility. And because every generation is a steward of democracy, the karmic development is such that this wound will continue to fester. This wound will continue to fester in us as a nation until some generation, and I suggest it be ours, stands up and says it is time for the karmic development. You know, if you look at a younger generation of Germans right now, it's fascinating to see how much has been flushed out. They're free. We finally have a young generation of Germans who are beginning to be free of this huge shame of the Holocaust. Why? Because this work has been done by the Germans. And that was 1945, that was over. We're still living with something that the Civil War ended in 1864. And you know, you can have a constitutional amendment that eradicates slavery. You can have a stroke of a presidential signature that, you know, the Emancipation Proclamation. Other generations' job on this issue was to eradicate the externalization of racist policies and institutions. It is our job to eradicate racism itself. And those of us who understand that the deeper problem is within, and who understand that healing cannot be legislated, but it is an activity of the heart. Once again, I say to those who are in the field of personal growth and recovery and spirituality, we know this. This is our purview. And this is just one of the ways in which I feel that those of us who do have an understanding of internal dynamics and live around these dynamics have so much to contribute. We have been withholding our gifts because this is one of many areas where the stuff that's natural to us and that we know all about is a piece very much missing in the political dialogue. We have a place, and to hear you actually articulating it and the legitimacy of this conversation in political terms is a true gift, not only to the country, but to all of us who didn't think our conversation had any place in the larger public sphere. So thank you so much. Does anybody else, because the way I had on the questions, anybody else have anything that you would like to bring up or to ask Eileen in terms of this, the things that she was talking about? I know if there's not, one of the things I would be interested in hearing a little bit more about is your international work and places where I know, do you know much about what happened with Rwanda and Rwanda and also the Truth and Reconciliation in South Africa that was very interesting? I'd like to hear about both of those if I could.
You know, it's really interesting because I've actually studied quite a bit about the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And actually, I was writing my first book on forgiveness when the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission went underway. And I became very, very interested, because of being a clinical and political psychologist, of how that process was going to look different from individual forgiveness.
And I just want to stop there for a moment. Political psychologist. Mm-hmm. I'm sure there are people in this audience and people on live stream going, I could be that.
Yeah.
Political psychologist. How cool is that?
Yeah.
Because the psyche of this country could use a little therapy.
It could use a little more than that. That's when the clinical also kicks in.
Yeah, it's gone into the pathological.
Are we a neurotic society or what? Anyway, I became very interested in watching what are the differences, and began to do research. And there's debate in the field of what is political forgiveness. And most people kind of make it something to be very parallel to individual forgiveness. And when you really think about Desmond Tutu and what he was doing with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, his idea wasn't to have a face-to-face experience with the victims and perpetrators. He wanted to include a lot of participation of the victims. But the TRC ran into difficulties, and so it turned more into victims forgiving the perpetrators. That was not his intent.
Wow. Wow,
and
that's fascinating.
And you know, we hear about these criticisms even to this day. And I had the good fortune to be able to be there to study some of this and to look at other countries. At that point, I was working actually in Indonesia, but I've since been to Rwanda. And I'm very, very interested in the Rwanda process because I remember learning about the Holocaust when I was a young child and thinking to myself, this cannot happen again anywhere to anyone. And yet now we're repeating it in Rwanda and in Syria now with, 200,000 people being killed and 9 million being displaced. In Rwanda, when you really look at the dynamics, and for all those that study about atrocities, and I know Diane was mentioning earlier about some organizations, you could see that we had a history of one group, the Tutsis, and another group, the Hutus. Now, at one time, the Tutsis, because of the dear old Belgians, were becoming the privileged group.
Right.
They were the ones that were educated. They're the ones that got the government jobs. And the Hutus were low caste. And by the way, people think that the difference is that the Hutus and Tutsis are different ethnic groups.
They're not, are
They're
they?
not.
No,
They're not. If you had more than 10 cattle, you became a Tutsi. If you had less, you were a Hutu.
Unbelievable.
It is really unbelievable. And if anybody goes to the Holocaust Museum in Rwanda, you're going to see all of this. It's very fascinating. So, of course, you're going to have that anger and that hatred fester and fester and fester. And there were things in the country that were building that anybody who studies genocide can now see that this was a long time in coming and it was building up. And so it was the haves and the have-nots.
Can you tell me, are there three things, one thing, two things, three things, whatever, that are factors that would be predictive, that we could look at and go, that's predictive of the probability of genocide?
Look at the history. When you have a group that is less than,
Yep.
they're going to come back and get you.
Okay.
That's
Wow.
a real big one right
Just
there.
kind of sit with that for a minute.
Did you all get that? Now, in Rwanda, the Hutus were stacking up arms. They've got one of the best cell phone services because of the genocide. So look at history. And that's why I became very interested in looking at genocide, because I wanted to be able to step in with the work of forgiveness to heal those wounds of anger and hatred before they flourish and fester, so they lead to cycles of abuse and violence. This is why this healing is so important. And when I look at forgiveness, and I've written on the individual level, and you were asking about the international work, I've been to places, and you were asking a little bit earlier about Israel and Palestine. You cannot go to Israel and Palestine and say to, let's say, the Israelis, forgive the Palestinians, and then we can work on the peace process. No. It's impossible to ask people to forgive other groups like that. But that does not mean that you cannot come together and make a commitment to forswear vengeance. And that's what political forgiveness is really about. And that's what differentiates it from individual forgiveness. That we make at least a commitment to forswear vengeance, and then to take a look at the past. And we have transitional justice systems. We have places where you can construct that historical memory, like the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. We've got to use transitional and restorative justice processes more creatively. And this is what political forgiveness looks at.
Of course, with the Israelis and the Palestinians, neither group feels it's about vengeance. Both feel they're living to really protect their lives and save their lives. Neither one of them feels I'm taking vengeance. They both feel I'm trying to keep that one from killing me. You have two victims of abuse, basically, and if you haven't processed your own abuse to a certain extent, you're simply not capable emotionally of being present for the suffering of the other.
That's right.
Which is the tragedy, and which is why I think those of us who are not Israeli and are not Palestinian can be of such service, because it's easier to see, the Course in Miracles says God does not give you victory in battle, but it lifts you above the battlefield. And I think those who either take this very strong line, either with Israelis or Palestinians, that fails to create the field of possibility that we really need, which is for those of us who are not in the maelstrom of it, who can more easily stand back and see the innocence inside them both.
And that's why I also spoke of the triple focus skill set.
Right.
That in order to do this healing work, and I'm actually writing a book on political forgiveness and the healing of nations,
Great.
we have to look at all these levels. You can't have one without the other.
Right.
You've got to have people doing that individual forgiveness work. And really that's where the schools of forgiveness and reconciliation fall. You also have to have people coming together in communities. And one of the things I didn't talk about in this particular talk was a process called Fomble Talk, which is something that developed in Sierra Leone because of the conflict that went on there that almost destroyed the entire country. So the people in Sierra Leone began to fall back on their own traditional conflict resolution and peace-building systems.
Right, because some ancient cultures were further ahead, and the restorative justice ideas were so arrogant. Modernity is so arrogant.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so they came up with a process that goes on like 3 to 5 years, which involves getting the community ready and asking them, are you ready to forgive? Do you know what forgiveness means? Do you know what reconciliation means?
But it's so important. It's interesting because it only emphasizes the importance of politics, because you could look at Israelis and Palestinians. This is a perfect example. There are plenty of people among the Israelis and among the Palestinians who are so interested in going there and so willing to go there. And what you have in both situations is what we far too often have in our own country, and so many, where the face of the government does not represent the more enlightened attitude.
Right.
And that's the tragedy, and that's why we need more people in government. You know, I know we keep trying to convince, don't just convince, take their seats. We need more people. You know, I envision an America, and I think it's probably safe to say that if you talked this way to the majority of people in Congress in the United States, Senate and in the House, they'd look to you, they'd smile, and well, it was so nice to meet you, and then she leaves and goes, she's a crazy lady. We need more people in Congress who would say, call up Eileen Borris, because that's the kind of work that we need done. Thank you for doing it. Thank you for forging the path. Do you have anything for us there, Charmaine, that comes from questions? This is Charmaine. Give Charmaine a hand. All right, this one is not particularly germane, from Charmaine. Hold on a moment. What about a new vision that is above the problem, where there are only solutions? Use the campaign money to help communities, have the media coverage be the candidate solution to all the people. I think that's the whole point, though. There is a limit to what we can do from the sidelines. I'm sorry, there's just a limit to what we can do. Nonprofits are very important, NGOs are very important, but it is government that is spending the billions of dollars, not the thousands and not the millions, on keeping in place certain forces that there's no amount of charity or non-governmental work that can compensate for basic social injustice. All right, we keep getting things that aren't specifically about this. Anything else that you'd like to bring up for us, Eileen? Anything else?
I just think that we really do need to speak to our congressmen and senators and to people in power. Just like you mentioned, I'm running a nonprofit. We don't have the funds to do all the work we want. We want to take the schools of forgiveness, for example, and be in every state of this country. And the beauty about the schools, by the way, is that anybody can participate in the program. And let's say you decide to take it and you love it and you say, Eileen, I'd love to facilitate it. We give you all the materials.
Right. I understand. I'm sorry.
And we multiply it. And so now you take it to your organization, to your community, and you do it, and somebody else there then wants to do it. And what we've seen, and this is the way it started actually in Bogota, Colombia, is that it went to 100 cities, and then it went over to the neighboring country, and now that's why it's throughout South America, because we want to build that political culture of forgiveness and reconciliation and a strong network of people, hopefully around the world, that supports this kind of thinking, this kind of healing, so we truly can have the healing of nations.
Right, and that goes back to what Diane Randall was saying. We spend our billions, $700 billion a year on the Pentagon, a fraction of that on the State Department, and then even a fraction of that on resourcing these kinds of projects. We don't spend our resources on peace building. We spend our resources on waging war because there's so much more money to be made than on waging peace. Once again, why we need people in Washington and politically active so that you have more people who are actually appropriating the money that goes to things like the State Department to fund programs like that. I have done quite a few racial reconciliations. I lived in Detroit for a long time. I have done racial reconciliation groups, and one of my I remember when President Clinton said we needed to have a national conversation on race. Well, we all know that pretty much petered out. Why did it peter out? Because it did not get to the level of the heart. Why did it not get to the level of the heart? Because there were not people trained in facilitating those conversations who were experts at creating emotional safety among all members of the group, including some who had 200 years of anger to express. And that's why there's such a spiritual dimension to that work. And I know once, something I have never forgotten, a very powerful moment in a racial reconciliation group in Detroit, and there was a young black woman that was saying all this stuff, and there was a white man in the circle who should be acknowledged for being there. I mean, certainly he showed up for it. But he said, "Oh, I've heard all this so many times," to which she responded, "But you never heard it from me." And that was very powerful. She had never heard it from me. And that was very powerful. She needed the safe space in which to say it. And my role was also to make sure that not only the circle was safe for her to express herself, but also safe for everyone else as well. And training people in this kind of work is so important, and I can't imagine anything I'd be more interested in than to see the government sponsoring this kind of work, sponsoring your, and I just can't thank you enough for enlightening us, because what all the speakers are doing is filling in these possibilities. Everybody here, if you're even here, you already have the right instincts. You already have you have the feeling of how it could be. But when you hear these people who are actually doing it and saying, it could look like that, it could be funded like that, it motivates you to not only make it happen, but inspires you to think that the whole thing is possible and we really could turn this thing around. Am I right? Yeah. Join with me. A great big round of applause. Thank you, Eileen Borris. Thank you so much. Oh, thank you. And what is your website? I'm sure you have.
You can go to, I just turned myself off, www.drEileenBorris.com, and make sure you click that tab that says Forgiveness International.
And you know what? You should do a training course. How many therapists here in this room? Okay? And I'm sure there are people watching. You should do a course in training people who are already licensed psychologists in adding to that they're political psychologists. There's such a field there. Good for you. Put it on your website, and I'll link to mine.
Thank you.